The Browns didn't wait for the offseason to admit something went wrong. And that's the part most people are missing. With the season barely over, Jimmy Haslam and the Cleveland Browns made a move that quietly exposed one of the biggest failures of the year, one that had been hiding in plain sight. Everyone keeps arguing about quarterbacks, about wins, about coaching, but the truth is simpler and more uncomfortable. None of it mattered if the foundation was already broken, and it was, badly. For weeks, fans watched Shedeur Sanders take snaps under constant pressure, not struggling because of reads, not failing because of decision-making, but because protection kept collapsing before plays could even develop. No quarterback, rookie or veteran, survives that for long, and yet the conversation kept circling everywhere except where it started. Now, with a late-season offensive line signing, the message feels different. This doesn't look like routine depth. It looks like urgency, like an organization trying to stop the bleeding before it defines the future. And that raises a bigger question: why now? At the same time, Kevin Stefanski continues to avoid direct answers about what comes next. Silence from leadership, hesitation from players, and sudden movement from ownership. When those things happen together, it usually means something is coming. Because teams don't make moves like this unless they're reacting to something they can no longer ignore. And once you connect this signing to the pressure on the quarterback, the coaching uncertainty, and the growing noise around Cleveland, it becomes clear. This wasn't just a roster tweak. It was a warning sign. And the reasons behind it tell a much bigger story. What makes this signing stand out isn't who the Browns brought in, it's when they did it. This wasn't a calm, off-season evaluation move made after weeks of internal review. This happened at the very end of the season, when most teams are shutting things down, not reshuffling core units. And that timing changes everything. Late-season signings like this usually send one message: something has gone wrong faster than expected. The Browns didn't just lose games this year, they lost control of the line of scrimmage. Week after week, protection broke down early. Pockets collapsed before roots could develop. And instead of fixing it quietly in the background, the front office was forced to act in real time. That's not strategic patience, that's reaction. From the outside, it might look like a simple depth move, but teams don't dip into the practice squad and reshuffle offensive line pieces this late unless they feel exposed. And Cleveland was exposed, nationally, weekly, and repeatedly. Fans saw it, opponents attacked it, and now ownership is responding to it. What's important here is what this move was. It wasn't about experimenting, it wasn't about development, and it definitely wasn't about long-term chemistry. Offensive line cohesion takes time. You don't fix it in January. You stabilize it so things don't completely unravel. That's where the word panic starts to creep in. Because if this were part of a long-term plan, it would have happened earlier, much earlier. Instead, it came after weeks of public frustration, mounting pressure, and growing concern about how much damage was being done to the quarterback position, especially to a young quarterback being asked to survive behind a unit that clearly wasn't holding up. This also explains why attention suddenly shifted away from the usual talking points. Less talk about scheme, less talk about play calling, more quiet acknowledgement that none of that matters if protection fails at the snap. It's a silent admission teams rarely make out loud. And that admission points upward. Moves like this don't happen without ownership awareness. When Jimmy Haslam starts addressing positional failures immediately instead of waiting for a reset, it suggests urgency at the highest level. Not curiosity, urgency. The kind that comes from realizing a problem is actively hurting the future, not just the present. That's why this signing feels heavier than it looks. It's not about one lineman replacing another. It's about an organization realizing too late that the damage was compounding every week. Confidence eroding, development stalling, frustration spreading. And once that realization sets in, Every move becomes loaded with meaning. Because now the question isn't whether the Browns know the offensive line failed. It's how long they knew and why it took this long to act. And when you start asking that question, the conversation quickly moves away from players and straight toward leadership. For most of the season, the conversation stayed focused on the surface. Quarterback play, play calling, coaching decisions. Those are easy targets. They're loud, they're visible, but they weren't the root of the problem. The real issue was happening before most plays even had a chance to breathe. Protection didn't just break down, it collapsed. Watching the tape tells a consistent story. Defensive pressure arriving almost instantly. Edge rushers meeting the quarterback before routes reach their first break. Interior linemen getting pushed backward, shrinking the pocket from the inside out. When that happens, decision-making becomes survival, timing disappears, confidence erodes, and even the simplest plays turn into damage control. That's the environment Shedeur Sanders was operating in. And here, where things get uncomfortable, this wasn't a one-game issue. It wasn't a bad matchup. It was weekly, predictable. Opposing defenses didn't need complex schemes to disrupt Cleveland's offense. They knew pressure would get home. They knew the pocket wouldn't hold, and they attacked it relentlessly. No quarterback thrives like that. Not a rookie, not a veteran, not even the best to ever play the position. Yet somehow, the narrative kept circling back to what the quarterback wasn't doing instead of what he couldn't do. That disconnect frustrated fans because the evidence was obvious. You could see it in body language, plays ending early, scrambles that weren't designed, checkdowns made out of necessity, not caution. When a quarterback stops trusting protection, everything speeds up in the worst way possible. Reads get rushed, mechanics break down, and mistakes that look mental are often structural. That's why the offensive line discussion matters more than any single stat line. This unit didn't just struggle, it limited the offense's ceiling. It took options off the table before they could be explored. Deep concepts became risky. Play action lost credibility, and the offense slowly compressed into something easier to defend. Not because of scheme, but because of survival. Fans recognized this long before any official acknowledgement came. They weren't excusing mistakes, they were explaining them. There's a difference. And that distinction matters when evaluating development. You don't judge growth in a broken environment the same way you do in a stable one. That's also why the late season signing feels like an admission, not just that the line wasn't good enough, but that it actively put the future at risk. When protection consistently fails, you don't just lose games. You risk habits forming. You risk confidence cracking. You risk a young quarterback learning the wrong lessons. And once that happens, fixing it takes far more than a new lineman or a fresh voice. This is where frustration turns into urgency. Because when an organization realizes it may have exposed its most important asset to unnecessary damage, the response isn't patience, it's reaction. And that reaction usually comes with questions nobody wants to answer yet. Questions about accountability, about timing, and about who allowed things to reach this point before stepping in. And those questions don't stop at the offensive line, they move upward fast. As the offensive line issues became impossible to ignore, attention naturally shifted to leadership. Not because fans wanted scapegoats, but because they wanted clarity. And that's where things started to feel uneasy. When questions grew louder, answers became harder to find. Throughout the final stretch of the season, Kevin Stefanski was repeatedly asked about the future, about direction, about whether changes were coming. And each time the responses stayed careful, measured, non-committal. On paper, that's professionalism. In reality, prolonged silence during uncertainty often signals something else entirely. Fans noticed it immediately. When players like Shedeur and Shedeur Sanders were asked similar questions, they also declined to comment. That wasn't surprising. Players are taught to stay out of front office conversations. But when everyone avoids the topic, it creates a vacuum, and vacuums get filled with speculation. Reports suggest that internal confidence in the current direction has been quietly thinning. Nothing explosive, no dramatic confrontations, just hesitation. And in the NFL, hesitation is dangerous. It tells players that decisions are being delayed. It tells fans that leadership isn't aligned. And it tells the locker room that change might be coming, even if no one says it out loud. The problem with silence is that it rarely calms anyone. Instead, it magnifies tension. Every non-answer feels intentional. Every pause feels loaded. And every move, like the late offensive line signing, starts getting interpreted as part of a bigger picture. That's why this stretch felt different from normal end-of-season uncertainty. It didn't feel like closure. It felt like avoidance. Stefanski's situation only amplified that feeling. He's been under scrutiny for weeks. Play calling, adjustments, game management. Now add a collapsing offensive line and a quarterback constantly under pressure, and the margin for error shrinks to nothing. In moments like that, strong leadership usually does one of two things: either takes ownership or clearly outlines the plan forward. Neither happened, and that absence became its own storyline. Fans didn't hear reassurance. They didn't hear urgency. They heard delay. And delay, especially after a season full of visible issues, feels less like patience and more like indecision. That's when confidence starts to erode, not just in outcomes but in direction. It also explains why coaching rumors suddenly felt louder. When leadership doesn't define the future, others will try to. And once names start circulating, fairly or not, it's hard to put that toothpaste back in the tube. None of this confirms anything on its own. Silence isn't proof. Avoidance isn't a verdict. But when it stacks on top of late roster moves, visible frustration, and mounting pressure, it creates a pattern that's hard to ignore. Because organizations don't go quiet when everything is settled. They go quiet when conversations are happening behind closed doors. And once that's the case, the next phase of the story usually unfolds quickly, sometimes faster than anyone expects. Once silence takes over, speculation isn't far behind. And in Cleveland, that speculation didn't come out of nowhere. Coaching rumors started surfacing because the conditions were perfect for them. Uncertainty at the top, visible on-field problems, and a fan base that could sense something shifting beneath the surface. Names began circulating quietly at first. Nothing official, nothing confirmed, just chatter. Reports claimed that alternative coaching options were being discussed in league circles, not because a decision had been made, but because people sensed vulnerability. In the NFL, that's all it takes. When a coach's footing looks unstable, even briefly, conversations start whether the organization wants them to or not. For Kevin Stefanski, this couldn't have come at a worse time. He was already facing criticism for conservative decisions and a lack of visible adjustment as the season unraveled. Add a broken offensive line and a quarterback under constant siege, and suddenly every choice gets magnified. Not just what's called, but what is. Fans didn't just want change for the sake of it. They wanted belief. They wanted signs that leadership understood the urgency of the moment. Instead, what they saw was hesitation. And hesitation creates a dangerous opening. It invites outside voices. It gives credibility to rumors that might otherwise be dismissed. That's why even speculative links to potential replacements gain traction. When people hear phrases like "it's being talked about" or "league insiders are watching," they latch on. Not because they're desperate, but because they're tired of waiting for clarity that never arrives. What's important to note is how this differs from past cycles. In previous years, coaching rumors often felt reactionary, tied to losing streaks or emotional fan responses. This time, it felt structural, less about record, more about direction, less about blame, more about alignment. That distinction matters. It suggests the conversation isn't just about whether Stefanski can coach. It's about whether his vision still matches where the franchise is headed. And when that question starts floating publicly, even as speculation, it becomes incredibly hard to silence. Meanwhile, voices outside Cleveland added fuel. Analysts, former players, rival fans. Everyone suddenly had an opinion on what the Browns should do next. That external noise increases pressure internally, especially when leadership hasn't drawn a clear line in the sand. And here's the part most fans understand instinctively. Coaching rumors don't gain momentum unless there's uncertainty behind the scenes. Stable organizations shut them down quickly. Unstable ones let them breathe. None of this proves a decision has been made. Rumors are not facts. Speculation isn't confirmation. But the presence of sustained speculation tells you something important. Confidence in the current structure isn't as solid as it once was. And when that confidence cracks, even slightly, organizations are forced to respond, either by reaffirming direction or by preparing for something new. That's why the next moves matter more than the rumors themselves. Because in moments like this, teams reveal who they really are, not by what they say, but by what they choose to do next. While coaching rumors dominated headlines and debates, the Browns quietly did something that spoke louder than any press conference. They moved on the offensive line, and not in a symbolic way, in a way that signaled acknowledgement, admission, even urgency. Replacing a key lineman at this stage of the season isn't about upside. It's about stopping further damage. The decision to bring in a new center to replace Wyatt Teller wasn't framed as a long-term fix, but the message underneath it was impossible to miss. The line had become a liability, and the organization could no longer pretend otherwise. For weeks, fans had been pointing to the same thing. Protection failures weren't occasional, they were systemic. The interior collapsed, communication broke down, and every adjustment felt reactive instead of corrective. When a front office finally acts this late, it usually means the internal evaluations have caught up to the external criticism. What made this move even more revealing was the tone around it. No celebration, no optimism-heavy messaging, just matter-of-fact acknowledgement. The kind that says, "This isn't good enough," without ever having to say it out loud. And then there was the emotional layer. When Wyatt Teller spoke to the media, his words carried weight, not because of what he confirmed, but because of what he didn't. There was no certainty, no confidence about what comes next, just reflection, appreciation, and a tone that sounded a lot like someone bracing for change. That doesn't automatically mean an exit, but it does suggest awareness that nothing is guaranteed anymore. Veteran reactions like that matter. They tell you how the locker room is processing what's happening. When players sense instability, even subtly, it affects morale, it affects preparation, and it affects how they view the future, especially when a unit that's been relied on for years suddenly becomes the focal point of scrutiny. This is where the offensive line conversation shifts again. It's no longer just about performance, it's about reset, about whether the Browns are preparing to turn over more than just one position group. Youth, flexibility, accountability. Those themes start appearing when teams feel the need to change direction without fully announcing it. And here's the key point. This move didn't calm the noise. It amplified it. Fans didn't see reassurance. They saw confirmation. Confirmation that what they'd been saying all season wasn't exaggerated, that the pressure on the quarterback wasn't imagined, and that the front office now sees the same urgency they've been screaming about. That's why this signing matters more than the player involved. It marks a line between denial and response, between hopping problems would solve themselves and stepping in before they get worse. And once an organization crosses that line, it rarely stops with just one move. Because when one unit gets exposed this publicly, it forces hard questions everywhere else, about preparation, about leadership, and about how much more needs to change before things actually stabilize. And those questions don't fade quietly. They demand answers, sooner rather than later. As if the internal tension wasn't enough, the conversation around Cleveland started spilling beyond the building. And that's when things really tightened. Because once outside voices start weighing in, the pressure stops being manageable and starts becoming unavoidable. Comments from players around the league began circulating, not direct shots, not harsh criticism, but observations that landed harder than people expected. When quarterbacks like Joe Burrow talk about pressure, sacks, and situational football, fans listen closely, not because he's talking about Cleveland directly, but because the subtext feels familiar. A quarterback discussing how pressure changes decision-making hits differently when Browns fans have watched their own quarterback absorb hit after hit all season. That's how narratives form, quietly, indirectly, and once they do, they're hard to shut down. Then came the coaching chatter. Reports suggested that respected defensive mind Jim Schwartz was being discussed as a potential option moving forward. Nothing confirmed, nothing formal, but the fact that the conversation even reached public ears was telling. Organizations with stable leadership don't allow that kind of talk to gain traction. It dies immediately. This didn't. What made it worse was the reasoning fans latched onto. Many weren't arguing scheme. They were arguing structure. They believed the problems went beyond one coach or one season, that the way things were being run, from preparation to accountability, needed a rethink. And when that sentiment becomes common, it's almost impossible for leadership to ignore. The timing mattered too. This wasn't mid-season frustration. This was end-of-season reflection. The moment when organizations are supposed to project clarity and control. Instead, Cleveland felt exposed, not because of leaks, but because of silence. Silence leaves room for interpretation, and interpretation fuels speculation. Outside analysts added to the fire, former players, media voices, rival fans. Everyone suddenly had an opinion on what Cleveland should do next. Some of it was unfair, some of it was exaggerated, but the volume alone created weight, and weight changes behavior. That's the danger of letting uncertainty linger. Because once the narrative shifts from fixable problems to organizational issues, the lens changes. Every move gets reinterpreted. Every non-move feels intentional. And every delay starts looking like fear instead of patience. This is where franchises either reassert control or lose it. The Browns now find themselves in that exact moment. Not because outsiders are attacking them, but because those outsiders see cracks they believe are real. And when that perception spreads, even internally, it accelerates decision-making whether leadership wants it to or not. So this isn't just noise anymore. It's pressure from every direction. Fans, media, league peers, and those pressures don't just disappear once the season ends. They carry into the offseason. And how the Browns respond to that environment will determine whether this period becomes the start of a reset or the beginning of another cycle they'll be trying to escape next year. When you strip away the rumors, the late signings, and the outside noise, everything leads back to one unavoidable truth. The Browns' most important decision hasn't even been officially made yet, and that decision centers on Shedeur Sanders. This is why the offensive line situation matters so much more than it looks on paper. It's not just about sacks or missed assignments. It's about environment. Quarterbacks don't develop in isolation. They absorb everything around them: the protection, the messaging, the stability, the confidence of the people making decisions above them. And right now, that environment feels unsettled. Fans aren't worried because Shedeur struggled. They're worried because they saw flashes despite the chaos. They saw poise under pressure, toughness when plays broke down, leadership in moments that weren't supposed to be his yet. And that creates a dangerous contrast. Because when a young quarterback shows promise in a broken structure, the fear isn't that he can't succeed. It's that the organization might not move fast enough to support him properly. That's where frustration turns into urgency. The Browns have lived this story before. Talented quarterbacks placed into unstable systems, protection failing, leadership unsure, and by the time clarity arrives, the damage is already done. Fans don't want to relive that cycle. That's why every offensive line move, every coaching rumor, every unanswered question feels amplified. They're not reacting to one season, they're reacting to history. What makes this moment different is awareness. Everyone sees the stakes now. Ownership, fans, the league. This isn't a quiet rebuild phase, it's a crossroads, and crossroads demand decisions, not deflection. The late offensive line signing wasn't just about stopping pressure, it was about acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that something went wrong. Acknowledgement that the quarterback was put in a tough position. An acknowledgement that the future can't be handled casually anymore. That's why patience is wearing thin. Not because fans are unreasonable, but because they understand timing. Windows don't stay open forever. Confidence doesn't either. If the Browns truly believe Shedeur is part of the future, then every move has to reflect that belief. Not eventually. Now. And that's the tension hanging over Cleveland as the season closes. Not whether change is coming, but whether it will come early enough to matter. Because if this organization hesitates at this moment, it won't just lose games. It risks losing trust from fans, from players, and from the very quarterback they may be asking to lead them forward. And once trust slips away, no amount of late fixes can bring it back easily. Which is why the next phase of this story won't be defined by words, rumors, or speculation. It will be defined by action. And whether the Browns finally choose to move with the urgency their situation demands. When you look back at how this season unraveled, it's clear the Browns didn't arrive at this moment by accident. It was a slow build, small cracks ignored, bigger problems explained away, and then one late-season move that finally made it impossible to pretend everything was under control. This was never just about signing another offensive lineman. It was about acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that protection failed. Acknowledgement that a young quarterback was put in a difficult position. Acknowledgement that waiting any longer could make things worse instead of better. That's why this moment feels heavier than a normal end-of-year adjustment. It's not optimism, it's urgency. And urgency usually means the organization knows it's running out of time to get ahead of the narrative. The Browns now sit at a familiar but dangerous point. They can treat this as a minor correction and hope the offseason resets everything. Or they can recognize it for what it is, a warning shot that the foundation needs more than patchwork fixes. Fans aren't asking for perfection. They're asking for direction. And right now, direction feels undefined. What complicates everything is that the pieces are already there. Talent exists. Belief exists, support exists, but alignment doesn't. And alignment is what separates teams that recover from teams that repeat the same cycle year after year. That's why this story doesn't end with one signing or one rumor. It ends with decisions that haven't been announced yet. Decisions about leadership, about structure, about how seriously the organization takes protecting its future instead of reacting to its past. The clock is ticking, whether Cleveland wants to acknowledge it publicly or not. Every offseason move will now be judged through the same lens. Does this protect the quarterback, or does it delay the inevitable? Does this create stability, or just buy time? Because fans have seen this movie before. They know how it ends when organizations hesitate. Windows close quietly. Confidence fades slowly. And by the time clarity arrives, the opportunity is already gone. This late offensive line move didn't solve anything on its own, but it did something far more important. It exposed the truth. The Browns know there's a problem. They know it can't be ignored anymore. And they know the next steps matter more than anything they've said all season. So as Cleveland moves forward, the question is whether change is coming. It's whether the Browns will finally move with purpose, or wait long enough for this moment to turn into another regret fans won't forget.